Hello, my name is Gerard Casey and I'm going to be your guide and mentor in this course on logic. So just a few quick words before we start. Logic and reason. Well, logic and reason aren't exactly the same thing. Reason is a little bit wider, but logic is the means by which we control the processes of our reason. It's the tool that we use to guarantee that what we're doing is sound and valid. And even though there are dry and technical parts of logic, it really is a most exciting study. Now, at times you may feel that we're going a bit too quickly and that you're losing your grip on the material. That's quite normal, and don't worry. You will find, as a matter of fact, that as we go further into the course, the material we do later will illuminate retroactively, as it were, retrospectively, the material we did earlier. On the other hand, you may be one of those people who feels we're moving too slowly. Well, don't worry, that feeling generally doesn't last very long. But if it does, then of course you are able to move through the course at your own pace. Let me talk about critical thinking for a little while. Some ability in formal logic is absolutely essential for critical thinking, whether this ability is acquired through instruction or whether you have it by nature. Now, it's not the only thing that you need for critical thinking. I would like to make that point absolutely clear. But without logic, thinking often goes badly astray, especially when the subject matter of the thought is complex or controversial. I want you to see this by taking the following little test. Why don't you answer the following questions, yes or no, as quickly as you can. So here's the first one. If it's true that all students are intelligent, does it have to be false that some students are not intelligent? Here's the second question. If it's true that no badly constructed logic examples are confusing, does it have to be false that some badly constructed logic examples are confusing? And finally, if it's false that all abortions are examples of non-homicide, does it have to be true that some abortions are not examples of non-homicide? When you were doing this last one, C, did you feel your brain melting? Well, that's not surprising. All right, here are the answers. Do, however, make an effort to answer these questions yourself before looking at the answers. The answer to all three questions is in fact yes. And the reason is that A, B, and C all exhibit exactly the same logically valid structure. If you saw this and got all the answers correct, well done. You may not need this course in logic, but then again, you may still have some work to do. A, in fact, is relatively easy to grasp. B, though it exhibits, as I said, the same logical structure as A, has a slightly more complex semantic content. That is to say, there's more stuff in it, and that inhibits our ability to see through to the pattern underneath. C, again, has the same structure as A and B, but the topic is emotionally charged because I'm talking about abortion. And the three negatives in that proposition or sentence tend to reduce comprehension drastically, so that unless you can see through the structure, unless you can see into the structure of that proposition, you're unlikely to be able to answer that question correctly. There's a general point I want to make here, which is that once negation enters into a proposition in any form, whether one of the negation or two or three, words like not or on or im or any of these words, comprehension dips drastically. For those who like to know such things, what we have in the case of A, B, and C is contradiction on the square of opposition. We'll be coming to that later in the course, and you'll be able to see why it is that they all exhibit the same pattern of reasoning and why it is that the answer is yes, but you'll have to take my word for it for the moment. Now, before I go on with the substance of the course here, I want to talk a little bit later on in this session about language. Let me just recommend some reading material so that you can broaden your horizons. So the following list of books is given so that you can find some complementary material in the course. Some of the books are actually quite old. There's a reason for that, which is that logic doesn't change all that much, and some are more recent. Some deal with issues that I don't cover. And some are included for the intellectually adventurous. In some cases you may find differences between what you get in these books and what appears in this course. Most of these differences will be minor, but the major reason for the differences is as follows, that If you think about it, for example, when you get a manual with a new computer, you'll discover that you don't really need to read about 90 or 95% of the manual. You only need to read about 5% of the manual in order to be able to operate the machine. The remaining 95% is in fact for reference. And the same is true with most logic books. So I've tried to reduce this course to the absolutely basic elements that you need to have in order to understand and to use logic. Sometimes there's a difference, there's a matter of style between the way I treat things, as between, say, whether immediate inference is always to be judged from the aspect of validity or sometimes merely mechanically. By the way, I don't expect you to understand that former sentence. If you do, you've already done some logic. But if you don't understand that sentence, don't worry. All will soon become clear, or at least relatively clearer. The treatment of logic now that I'm giving you in this course is the result of over 30 years teaching of the subject, with the result that I've smoothed out many of the rough edges and, if you like, got the content of my course down to more or less the absolute minimum. I've tried to make it as simple as possible, however, without falsifying anything. I've left out material, as I said, which are treated in other books because I deemed that it wasn't necessary or it was simply confusing. Now, as we go through the course, I'll indicate where you can find parallel treatments of particular topics in the books that I'm going to give you. Usually I'll just give the author's name and the relevant page numbers. Where books that I cite have multiple editions, see for example the books by Copey and Kahane, I'll give the chapter and section number or numbers. And if you have access to a different edition earlier or later, you should be able to locate the relevant section. And the references to Geach, by the way, because I mentioned 2 books by Geach, are to his book Logic Matters. So the first book is by Peter Alexander, An Introduction to Logic, The Criticism of Arguments. This is quite a good book and may be available. Coffey's Science of Logic is a very old book, but still a very good book. Copey's Introduction to Logic, I'm referring to the 7th edition here from 1986, has gone through multiple editions and should be easily available. Again, Wayne Davis's book, An Introduction to Logic, is another standard in the field and should be available in some public libraries and probably in most university libraries. Howard Kahane's Logic and Philosophy, A Modern Introduction, is another standard and should be available pretty much everywhere. The book by Kegley and Kegley, Introduction on Logic, is more difficult to get but useful to use if you can find it. David Kelly's Art of Reasoning is another good book, and Raymond McCall's Basic Logic is a gem. If you can find it, by all means get hold of it and use it. I've made extensive use of it myself. Later on in the course I'm going to be doing some informal logic and general reasoning, and here I take the opportunity just to give you some references to some books that you might like to look at here. The first one is by Jean Fanstock and Marie Seeker. It's called A Rhetoric of Argumentation, and this is a very good book. Trude Grovier's book, A Practical Study of Argument, is more or less a standard treatment of informal logic. The book by Kaplan and Kaplan, Bozo Sapiens, Why to Err is Human, is simply put in here for your entertainment. There's no need to read it if you don't want to, but if you want to amuse yourself, you could read this. And Michael Scriven's book, Reasoning, from 1976, is one of the older books in the area of informal logic, but it's still a very good book. Anthony Weston's Rulebook for Argument is a book you should really buy. It's in multiple editions. I'm referring to the 4th edition, there may be a 5th. It's a very short book and it's not at all expensive, and you could read this for advice on assessing and constructing arguments. And finally, Douglas Walton's book on informal logic, A Handbook for Critical Argumentation, is still good and worth reading if you can get access to it. Now, these are books to stretch your mind. The book by Otto Bird, Syllogistic and Its Extensions, Wayne Booth's Modern Dogma and the Rhetoric of Assent, and Bradley and Schwartz's Possible Worlds. Please don't, I would suggest that you don't read these books immediately. Leave them for later investigation. But they will show you just how far logic extends and how many exciting areas it reaches into. Peter Geach's book, Logic Matters, is interesting. Geach has his own take on logic, and it's idiosyncratic in some ways, but always worth reading. His other book, Reason and Argument, is also worth looking at. Susan Hack's book, Philosophy of Logic, from 1978, is a very sophisticated philosophical treatment of logic, and again, worth looking at if you're adventurous. And Henry Veitch's Two Logics is idiosyncratic, cranky and brilliant, and always worth reading. Alright, now back to what it is that we want to talk about in logic. And one of the first things you notice about logic is that it's indissolubly connected with language. So let's look at language and let's look at its uses. The uses of language are clearly to communicate information, that's fairly obvious, but also to ask questions, to express surprise, joy, relief and anguish, to tell the truth, and, regrettably, to deceive and to lie, to sing songs and to tell stories. So one of the things that we notice about language is that it's a multi-purpose instrument. What's the connection between language and truth? Is language always expressing truth? Are we always saying things that are capable of being true and false when we use language? The answer, surprisingly, is in fact no. If you think about it, wishes, questions and so on are not truth relational. That is to say, if I say, I wish I had $1 million, or do you come here often? It's true that I've said these things, but these propositions or sentences aren't themselves true. Opinions and judgments are truth relational. Things like, I like broccoli or taxation is theft. But wishes and all of the questions, for example, these are not truth relational. They do not have, if you like, they're not truth functional. They don't have a truth value. So at the bottom of the slide, I've made a little display, and I've shown you the non-truth relational language on the left here: orders, commands, requests, wishes, hopes, fears, questions, jokes, and so on. And on the right, we have truth relational language, facts or would-be facts, narratives, stories, moral and political judgments, and arguments. So that's the first thing to grasp, that not all uses of language are meant to have a truth component. We can make a second division of language within the truth relational part, and we can divide language into non-argumentative and argumentative. So the non-argumentative language related to truth would be things like narratives, telling stories, simple statements of fact, like I like broccoli, which is not a statement of fact in my case, and histories. And on the other hand, argumentative language, where the argument is a structure of sentences in which the truth of one sentence conclusion is said to follow from the truth of others' premises. We're going to be coming back to this quite frequently, so don't worry if you don't understand it immediately. But I suspect that you already understand the essence of this claim, that argument is about one sentence following, in some sense, following from others. That's the key thing about argument. Just a quick comment on Aristotle and Locke. Human beings, in fact, have always argued. They didn't have to wait until logic was invented before they argued. And John Locke once remarked that God hasn't been so sparing to men to make them barely two-legged creatures, and left it to Aristotle to make them rational. To be fair, actually, to Aristotle, he didn't think he was making men rational when he invented his logic. He did, however, hit upon the idea, and this is one of the key ideas in the development of civilization, that the goodness or badness of arguments is independent of their content, and that there is, in fact, a small number of types of good argument. I can't emphasize enough just how important this idea is. The idea is that the goodness or badness of arguments depends, if you like, on their shape, pattern, or structure, and not on what the arguments are about. So you can distinguish between what an argument is about and whether or not it's a good argument. And that really, in many ways, is the key to logic. So, who needs logic? Well, anyone who wants to think straight and to argue well, and I hope that means you. As we saw when we looked at our examples earlier, A, B, and C, when arguments are simple and their subjects uncontroversial, most people can get it right. But when the arguments become complex, and especially when negatives abound, or when the subject matter is controversial, then our native intuitions are in fact prone to error, and we need all the help we can get. I want to make it clear, of course, that in learning logic, we are not learning to do something we have no previous experience of doing at all. In logic, we learn to appropriate reflectively and practice better what it is that we already know unreflectively how to do. If you think about it, it's like grammar. Nobody learns to speak his native language by being taught grammar. But when you learn your language, you learn its grammar, as it were, implicitly. During your education, when you're taught a subject called grammar, what you're doing is learning to reflectively appropriate what it is that you have already grasped in your language. And in logic, we're doing something very similar. The logic we're going to be learning in this course was formalized by Aristotle 2,500 years ago. Beginning in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, new forms of logic were developed: propositional logic, predicate logic, and somewhat later modal logic, together with deontic and epistemic logics. If you want to see what goes on here, have a look at Bradley and Swartz. I'm not going to be looking at this material. It just takes us too far afield, and in practical terms, the older logic from Aristotle is still the more useful, and that's what we'll be learning in this course. However, if you would like a sort of teach-yourself version of propositional and predicate logic, please email me at gerard.casey@uct.ie, and I'll send a short, as it were, DIY course on the material to you. For a treatment of modal logic, of course, you can again see Bradley and Swartz. Alright, let's talk very briefly then about inference. That's a subject we'll be coming back to in greater depth much later on, but for now let's just look at it. The idea of the truth of one sentence, as it were, following from the truth of others, is at the heart of logic. The technical name for this following is called inference, and inference really is the key. We already have an intuitive understanding of what inference means, and logic is all about inference. It's the process by which we move from one or more sentences or propositions. I'm in fact going to use the term proposition from now on to refer to truth-related sentences. So we move from one or more sentences or propositions to another proposition which is taken to be implied in it or them. And logic is the scientific study of inference. That's what logic is. Now, I'd like to distinguish briefly between formal and informal argument. Restricting our attention to the argumentative use of language, we can distinguish between informal argumentation and formal argumentation. And again, I've tried to display the differences between the two in this table. Informal argumentation deals with inferences in which the truth of the conclusion is less than conclusively demonstrated. That is to say, it's possible for the premises of an informal argument to be true, and yet for the conclusion to be false. Whereas in formal argumentation, we have the opposite situation. Formal argumentation deals with inferences in which the truth of the conclusion is conclusively demonstrated. In other words, in a good, that is to say valid formal argument, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true as well. There is a kind of rational compulsion in play in formal argumentation. I'll say that again. In other words, in a good, valid formal argument, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true as well. Here are some further references to the reading material I gave you on the subject. So you can see Alexander, pages 21 to 22, Copy, chapter 2, Kegley and Kegley, pages 3 and 4, 51 to 78. Before I actually get down to the serious business of logic, let me just make a few more comments. First, on form versus content. I've just mentioned this very briefly. Let's realize, if we can, clearly that logic is first and foremost a study of formal argumentation. And it's called formal because it focuses its attention on the form or structure of the argument rather than on its matter or on its content. That's key. I'd like you to think about that for a second before we move on. In formal logic, we are going to be paying attention to the pattern, the shape, the structure, or the form of the argument rather than on what the argument is about, its content. And formal logic is very powerful and very useful, but it's important to realize that it's only part of a wider context of argumentation. So there is more to human thinking and reasoning than formal logic, but formal logic lies at the heart of it. We'll be learning some elementary informal logic later on in the course. And finally, I want to talk about the relationship between theory and practice. It is the case that formal logic and what we might call natural reasoning don't quite match perfectly. They're not, to use the language of logic here, coterminous. Their boundaries don't perfectly coincide. Natural reasoning occurring in and through natural language tends to be messy, redundant, and imprecise. That's the nature of language. Formal logic, on the other hand, is clear, concise, and precise. So a question arises: if this is the case, when the two don't match, which takes priority? Are natural reasoning in language or formal logic? Well, logicians differ on this. Some think that natural reasoning should accommodate itself to formal logic if there's a difference, and others think that logic must accommodate itself to natural reasoning. To put it a little differently, Logic emerges from our natural practices of reasoning and argumentation. Some aspects of our argumentative practices are difficult to capture in any formal structure. On the other hand, some structural details of a given logical system may not necessarily be locatable in our argumentative practices. I believe, now logicians differ on this, but I believe that practices and the intuitions embodied in those practices come first, and that theory must in the end accommodate itself to those practices. Notoriously, some people, for example, like Bertrand Russell, thought the opposite. In other words, that if there was a difference between theory and practice here, that practice had to change to accommodate itself to theory. So here's a diagram showing, making the point. So the red squiggly line shows you the boundaries of natural argumentation, and the nice neat rectangle with sharp edges and sharp corners shows you formal logic. So you can see there that there would be parts of natural argumentation that are outside the bounds of formal logic, and there are little parts of formal logic that are outside the bounds of natural argumentation. Well, that's all for this particular session. I think that's probably enough to meditate on. Think about it, and in the next session we move on to a study of the categorical proposition.